Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Darsh Shah.
And I'm Dr. Altamash Raja.
And welcome to Medicine Redefined,
a podcast where we will explore the often overlooked but necessary components of health, what we consider to be the fundamentals.
We will investigate topics and practices that can give you and your patients the best chance to optimize a healthy lifestyle. It's time to move the needle forward and put the health back in healthcare.
Our guest today is Lauren Link. Lauren is the Assistant Athletics Director for Sports Nutrition for Purdue University Athletics. She oversees the sports nutrition program and specifically works with football, men's basketball, volleyball, and soccer. Her primary duties include individual and team nutrition education, providing counseling, evaluating supplements for legality, safety, and efficacy, body composition, and identifying athletes at high risk for injuries, and managing seven-figure budget to provide all teams with adequate and appropriate supplementation. For her education, she graduated from Purdue University with her bachelor's in Dietetics and Health, Nutrition, and Fitness. She also received her master's in Health and Kinesiology. She stuck around to complete the coordinator program in Dietetics at Purdue University, and during her time at Purdue, she was a member of the women's soccer team with academic All Big Ten honors from 2008 to 2011. In 2017, she also published her first book, The Healthy Former Athlete, which is a perfect resource to help athletes bridge to becoming, quote, normal humans. In this episode, we talk about a lot, starting off with Lauren's top pet peeves in the current mainstream nutrition landscape. We then dive right into the meat of this episode and discuss high-performance nutrition and how she caters to the unique needs of elite athletes. We discuss specific macronutrients for high-performance athletes and also weekend warriors by providing some specific examples to give you some guidelines on creating your perfect nutrition plan for your optimal performance. Lauren also shares some strategies and tactics for monitoring team-based athletes' nutritional needs and how to keep young athletes accountable when they are on their own for the first time. Now, high performance isn't just limited to a physical aspect, so we do spend some time talking about nutrition and its role with cognitive performance. Lauren shares her insight into how she thinks about optimizing this facet of performance with nutritional intervention. Of course, performance isn't just for sports, so we wrap up by covering some key lessons that can be extracted for the rest of us who aren't elite athletes. Lastly, you'll want to stick around for the very end to hear some of Lauren's favorite supplements, keeping in mind that they are supplemental. Don't worry, she'll tell you. Now, without further delay, please enjoy this discussion with Lauren Link. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought I'd start by talking about pet peeves. I've been following your work for some time, and I've heard you speak. And I know that this is probably a topic that we could do a whole separate podcast on. So I'm going to give you some guardrails, okay? And I'd like to hear about currently, what are the top three nutritional trends at this time that really grind your gears?
Man, it is hard to pick just three because I could probably pick 30 at any given time.
I know, that's why I gave you that.
But I mean, I think honestly, I could make a couple kind of big buckets. It probably will always be the case, the quick fix supplements going around. And again, I could pick a dozen right now that are popular on social media and things, but that is frustrating for lots of reasons, in part because there's not science to back them up, generally speaking. And so not only are people probably wasting some money on something like that, they go out and buy the supplement and think it's going to solve all their problems. But what people don't realize is that supplements are very poorly regulated as well. And that's a big point that I try to emphasize to people that I talk to, is that they're really poorly regulated. And so not only are you probably wasting some money, you're maybe putting yourself in a predicament in terms of if you're taking a medication or you're taking another supplement, there could be interactions, there could be negative health consequences. So that's a big one. It's just the supplement craze that's going around right now and all the quick fixes that come along with them. So that's one. I know it's a big bucket. Another pet peeve, again, a huge bucket, but people getting their nutrition information from influencers and folks that have no credentials. And that's probably one of the more frustrating things about our profession, is that people are more willing to listen to the random gym person on Instagram or on TikTok that have 5 million followers despite them having no education. So that's a huge pet peeve, and something, honestly, the only reason probably that I really spend the time to do social media is I feel like I have to fight the good fight and try to put science-backed information out there. And then a third pet peeve, it's a little bit similar to number one, and these are like really pretty big topics, but similar to just like the diet fads that we just recycle, every few years. If we had $1 for every different low carb diet that was out there, we would retire. But yet people just keep eating it up, right? And you talk about wasting money and that trend or the cycle that ultimately leads to probably more weight gain, unfortunately. So I'm digressing a little bit, but those three very large topics are big pet peeves of mine and encompass a lot of what frustrates me in regards to nutrition online, especially.
Yeah, I love that. No, and I think that the other important piece with the supplements, particularly in your world, right, when you're working with high performance individuals, high performance athletes at the collegiate level, professional level as well, the drug to drug interactions is a big one for people in my clinic. But when you're working with athletes, you also have to be very mindful that anything you put in your body, you're taking full responsibility. It could be, NSF sports certified and all that kind of stuff like that. And we've seen this. How many times have we seen an NFL athlete who got positive, was, tested positive for something and said, oh, it was a supplement that I took or something like that. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. But the onus is on that individual that, hey, you're making that decision. So that's like another really important thing. I am going to come back to influencers at the very, very end, because I do think that that's it's somewhat of a double-edged sword. And I would say that both of us are in that category too, because we are on social media. I am podcasting, that kind of stuff. But
Sure.
let's shift to talking about really the stuff that you get excited about, the stuff that one of the things that's your level of expertise, right? And that's nutrition for high performance individuals, particularly collegiate athletes, elite high school athletes, and maybe even a level beyond that, Olympic level athletes. What differentiates folks at that level, like their nutritional requirements for, let's just say, the weekend warrior or the general population, quote unquote?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's maybe a little bit hard to objectify, but I usually define, if you will, an elite level athlete as someone, it's almost like a job, right? These people are spending on the low end a couple hours a day, on the high end 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a day training for their sport. And that can encompass, of course, practice and skill development, but it also encompasses weightlifting, conditioning, even film, time spent in film study and things like that. So I think people overlook that even at the collegiate level, our athletes here, it practically is a 40-hour-a-week job. And they're doing that on top of their studying and social life and all that other stuff. So that's one of the big things I would say, is just the pure amount of time spent going into it. And then I guess, to some degree, right, you can talk about, are they competing at an elite level? Are they, are they participating in a league against other elite level players? But I think the time is the biggest one. That's what I come back to a lot, is just the pure amount of time that these people are putting into betterment of their sport and their physical abilities.
Yeah. Yeah. Not all of us have the luxury, which is why it's so challenging to have a conversation with somebody who can't designate that much time because of their, external responsibilities, other priorities, right? Offline, we're talking, both of us have, kind of a toddler, and there's only a certain amount of time that we can allocate to our recovery, our nutrition, or, or exercise and that kind of stuff. And you're just not at some point going to get the results. And that's okay. We just have to prioritize as you kind of go through different phases of life. That's what's the most important thing. And so the challenge that becomes is, when you do follow your idol, or if you're a high school athlete and you're not sleeping well, or I'm not even talking about physiology wise, like a high schooler following a professional athlete, but you just can't put in, and so you can't expect to get the same thing out. And that's why you have to individualize the protocol, which leads me to another important question. As you know, I'm a sports medicine doctor, and we do a lot of musculoskeletal medicine. And one of the things that we often talk to people about, and I was actually listening to this last night. Are you familiar with Eric Cressy?
Not well. I've heard the name, but not
Yeah.
well.
So yeah, he's a pretty pretty popular strength and conditioning coach, really big in the baseball world, and I think he's like the the consultant for the Yankees at this time. But somebody who's brilliant that I've looked up to for quite some time. He was on the Ferriss podcast yesterday, and we were just talking about just nutrition and your movement quality and that kind of how they're just so closely intertwined. People like Kelly Starrett with his new book, they've always been talking about what we put into our body really drives performance recovery as well. And I'll often find myself talking to my patients and my athletes about, hey, what you eat or like how you feel yourself, right? Feels your performance, but also dictates your recovery and how you experience pain and all that stuff. But I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really think the science is quite clear that at least nutrition and performance and injury recovery, right? We have these ideas of inflammation and whatnot, and we talk about fish oil and supplementation, coming back to that. But it's really hard to tease that out. So, as somebody who does this full time and does it at a high level, how do you think that your nutrition impacts your performance in terms of athletic performance, but also recovery and injury prevention?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you're right. It's really hard to quantify, and it's a really hard thing to study, right? Because what do? Follow a group of athletes and hope that somebody gets hurt along the way and then try to figure out, what went wrong for that person or what have you. So, and of course, there's a ton of factors that go into injury, unfortunately, a lot of which might be bad luck or bad timing or so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard to quantify, but I think absolutely we see that it factors in to performance, and a lot of it might be anecdotal, but that's part of what I love about my job is hearing that kind of feedback from athletes. Working with, let's say, a female team, I love getting them to buy into, for instance, carbs. We all, for whatever reason, actually we know the reason, social media, have this kind of inherent fear of carbs anymore because we've heard they're fattening, they're toxic, they're bad. I mean, pick a word. And so our athletes hear the same things. And I love seeing when athletes can kind of buy in and start to understand, like, no, okay, I need to fuel, I need to put, regular fuel in my body, or regularly fuel my body. And I hear them come back and say, I have so much energy. Oh my gosh, I'm running faster. Oh, I got my best time. I lifted the most weight that I've ever lifted. I hear that all the time with athletes who have started to really kind of buy into this idea. And they'll make comments too, like, it's probably the food, right? And I'm like, yes, it probably is. And it's not to say it's only the food, right? And that's what makes it challenging, is that it's sleep, it's just how hard you go in the weight room and in your effort level and all kinds of things. But it absolutely makes a difference. We see it anecdotally, at least like day in and day out, where athletes are fueling how we want them to fuel and seeing results on the end. And then similarly, you mentioned like recovery and injury prevention. We talk about that a lot. And it's another kind of one of those anecdotal examples, but we often find that the athletes who don't get a lot of sleep, right? They're up late, they're not managing their time well, so they're cramming for the test right before, or they're up on their phones until the wee hours. And those same athletes are usually the ones that break down a little bit more. They have those nagging injuries. They get sick a lot more often. And so that's just sleep as an example, but nutrition, I feel the same way. It's like those athletes who are habitual bad hydrators, habitually skipping meals, never grab the post-workout recovery shake. Same ones often are the ones that have those nagging injuries, or they're just like never quite 100%. And what pans out from that is they're not on the field as much, right? And if you're not on the field at practice, you're not going to be on the field for the game. And so it trickles along and into these bigger impacts. And so I think that's a big thing that I try to have athletes understand, is it's all about habits, and it's about consistently doing those things. It's not about doing like a really great job one day. It's about not missing meals every day. It's about hydrating every day, consistently having protein and carbohydrate. And if you do those things over and over and over, you're going to feel better. You're going to perform better. And if you perform better at practice, you're more likely to win the starting spot, and you're more likely to have success in the games. And so it builds on itself. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but that's I agree with what you said. Yes, we see it pan out in all those aspects of performance. And it's something that we're consistently trying to get our athletes to understand and buy into. Because if you have a whole team do that consistently, that's when you start to see teams that win championships.
No, I love that you mentioned that, because I think the other point about studying it prospectively in a longitudinal study is which person, which high level athlete, whether it's an Olympic athlete, collegiate athlete, kind of where you're working with professional, is going to sign up and say, yeah, we're only going to control for my nutrition, and I'm not going to pay attention to my sleep and soft tissue work and, training in the weight room and stuff like that. When you have so much on the line, it's pretty hard to limit to that. So that's one other challenge of it. What you're talking about is brilliant, because as the saying goes, right, the best ability is availability, right? And so the more often you're there for practice, the more you're available, the likelihood that you're going to perform at a high level. And speaking of availability, what we've seen over the last 20 years, it seems like, is more and more high level athletes tend to be available for their teams for longer periods of time. Let's use two prominent examples: LeBron James, Tom Brady. Tom Brady's retired, we hope, for good. But LBJ, right? So he just 38-year-old last game. I don't know if you got a chance to watch that, but 40-point performance, just remarkable. And it seems that a lot of players are playing into their late 30s, early 40s. I'm wondering what your experience with this is, and how much you think. Right before I'm thinking about Tom Brady. Sorry to digress. Tom Brady talked about avocado ice cream, and it's like, yes, nutrition has to do with everything and stuff like that. And people are like, oh man, I got to eat avocado ice cream, and therefore I will perform better, and I will be, longer in the game and that kind of stuff. But understanding that maybe they hate avocado ice cream and that's not actually feeding their goals. How do you have that conversation? Well, two-parter. What are your thoughts about that? Nutrition for longevity, particularly for high level sport, and then how do you have that conversation for these people? Is that, hey, listen, maybe that's not the way to go, maybe that's not the best way to be consistent, and it's actually about the principles with your high level athletes?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that nutrition can promote longevity in sport. It is something, again, that we talk to our athletes about, and especially the athletes that aspire to play at the next level. Really trying to get them to understand that, you want to get to that next level, but you also want to stay there, right? Because if you want the big paychecks, those come down the line. So I do think it's important for sure. And I think that a lot of times it really does kind of build on itself early in their career. And I don't know Tom Brady's injury history, verbatim, but I think you could pick lots of examples where oftentimes the guys, and I'm just using football as the example, a lot of times the guys that make it 8, 10 plus years in the NFL are guys that didn't have a lot of injuries in college. And why didn't they have a lot of injuries in college? Again, very multifaceted, but they were probably fueling pretty well. They were probably making smart choices off the field, not doing a ton of partying, not doing a ton of recreational things in terms of drugs, alcohol, whatever you want to put in that category, because those things do add up. I think the other thing maybe to think about injury that we talk a lot about is that, if we're not fueled, let's use carbohydrate as an example. If I don't have enough carbohydrate on deck, that affects my energy levels, yes, but it also affects my cognitive ability. So if I'm a football player, the difference of me being fueled and having, glucose on deck for my brain to use is huge. It might be a split second that I'm late to a hit and then I take it weird. It might be that I, am not as explosive, and that can be a different tweak on the joint. It's a matter of so many teeny little details, and it's not that nutrition is going to fix them or prevent them all, but we see it all the time. An athlete who's hungover or an athlete who's high is way more likely to get injured. And we do know that. Like, there are good studies out there to show that. And so I think, again, just to kind of bring it full circle, it starts in high school, it starts in college. Those athletes who have had better habits and who are consistent with those things are probably building more muscle mass. They're probably better conditioned, and they're probably, learning the playbook better. They're probably paying more attention, and all of those things set you up to be less likely to get injured and sick. And those things set you up for later as well. It's just like so intertwined, the whole kind of journey that these athletes go on. So absolutely, to close that thought, I do think it involves or attributes to longevity for sure.
Speaking of athletes being high. Did you see what Le'Veon Bell said recently?
No,
You're familiar with Le'Veon Bell, correct?
I am. Yes.
Yeah, I might have read this somewhere that he talked about how he would smoke a bunch of marijuana and then go out and play literally right before games, and just he was like, yeah, I'd run 150 yards and score 2 touchdowns or something like that. I don't know how much truth there is in that statement, but I thought it just reminded me that you mentioned that. But yes, no question about it. Nobody's endorsing that, and again, going back to you are not Le'Veon Bell, so we cannot endorse that in any way whatsoever. But you brought up carbs a couple times now. You seem to be a fan of them for good reason, right? Who isn't, right? So let's talk about some macronutrients. So carbohydrates, for those who know, the big macronutrients, right? We have carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Really, those three main ones, right? What some key macronutrient considerations for the high performance athlete? We'll say high level collegiate athletes, professional athletes, in terms of optimal balance for carbs to proteins to fats, if there is even such a thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's incredibly involved depending on lots of different factors. But from a really general standpoint, I mean, for sure, athletes need lots of protein, right? We know this, and I think protein often gets the most hype or attention when it comes to athletes because people think protein, muscles, they need lots of it. And okay. And so that's true. We do need more protein as an elite level athlete, especially depending on the sport, but we're starting to understand that even endurance athletes need more protein than maybe we once thought. And so what I often recommend athletes think about versus, thinking about how many grams per kilogram, and some of that's just not very realistic, especially for the athletes I work with who are also college students and thinking about lots of things. They don't necessarily want to be thinking about their macros. I tell them to think about it in terms of what's going on their plate. So if you think about, this is a very basic principle, but it works across lots of levels. If you think about your plate and divide it into thirds, for instance, I recommend that's as a good baseline. Athletes should be looking to have a third of their plate from carbohydrate, a third of their plate from protein, and a third or so from fruits or vegetables. And so from a protein standpoint, that's important. And actually, most people, especially within America, we get enough protein. We get lots of protein. But our biggest problem is that it's not spaced out well. It's not timed very well. So maybe I don't have any protein for breakfast because I grabbed my piece of toast or my Pop-Tart or something on the way out the door. Maybe I have some at lunch and then I have a whole bunch at dinner because I have 2 chicken breasts and I don't know, pick the rest of the plate. What I would rather my athletes think about is, am I getting protein every time I eat? Because muscle protein synthesis is happening all day long. It's not just happening at our lift or at practice. And so I want there to be protein available to support that process throughout the day. So again, thinking back to the plate, like every time I'm making a plate, I want there to be protein on it, and it should be about a third, let's say. Same thing from a carbohydrate standpoint. I want there to be carbohydrate consistently in my diet so that I'm making sure my glycogen stores, which I often refer to as our fuel tank. I want to make sure that my fuel is topped off heading into practice. And so that's, again, a really basic way to look at it to start. And then there's, of course, going to be lots of instances where that changes, right? But the biggest thing is that, our amounts might change. Maybe my carbohydrate needs to just be closer to a fourth of my plate because have a, lower expenditure right now, or I'm injured or whatever, have an off week. Fine, it goes down. Maybe it's actually the opposite. Maybe I'm doing a ton of activity. Maybe I'm a high school athlete playing 2 sports, or I'm in preseason camp and we're doing 2-a-days and I need half my plate carbohydrate because I'm burning through a ton of energy. All of these things can change. Where I'm going with this is I never tell an athlete to get rid of any one of those components. You always need some amount of carbohydrate on your plate. You always need some amount of protein on your plate. So I've now forgotten if I'm answering your question, but that's kind of where I take macronutrients to start from an athlete standpoint, is how can we make this really relatable and easy to think about throughout the day? And I want for sure carbohydrate and protein on the plate always, but we could tweak how much we're talking based on what they've got going on. Fat, I do not make a special place on the plate for. We tend to work it in pretty naturally in other foods. But if it was an athlete who's having a hard time keeping up with their energy needs or trying to gain weight, like we might strategically use extra fats in the diet to get those calories up.
Yeah.
So tell me how I did answering that question. I might have
No,
lost
it's
track.
no. It was great. It was the perfect answer from a practitioner, right? I think that sometimes folks such as myself, and we get to be highly analytical, and we get to we start majoring in the minors, and people, you can tell like who is often working with real people who are crunched for time, as you mentioned, and so you're trying to simplify the process, which is why from time and time again I've given a shout out to precision nutrition, because I think that's something that they've excelled at, which has made them so successful. I'm sure you're familiar with their work, right? It's like we're talking about fist size, of this is how you measure it. Not everybody has the luxury of putting it on a scale, waiting for it. Like that's just obtrusive to everybody's natural life, and you're not going to have you might have efficacy, but it's not going to be effective, right? So that's a key point. I do find it interesting that you think that most people are appropriately dosing protein, because I think as the conversation has ramped up with the whole longevity piece, there are people out there saying, oh my God, we need to actually curtail back on the protein because, mTOR activation, blah, 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 this and that. And it's not going to be optimal for lifespan. And I think the current RDA recommendation of zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram, I think that's ridiculous to begin with. Again, now I'm shifting from the high performance athlete, the collegiate athlete, the people that you're working with, but I'm talking to the general population, where we have 4 to 5 out of every 10 people are actually clinically obese, with a BMI greater than 30, where they could increase the protein intake and feel more satiated and perhaps curtail back on the other macronutrients, right? I think it's going to be better for, just long-term overall general health. The other piece I want to get your take on is your female athletes. When I was in a prior career, when I was working with, as a strength and conditioning coach, working with a lot of my female athletes, I found that they did struggle more getting adequate protein. And I'll describe adequate protein as so I think it's 1.4 grams per, 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram is the ISSN recommendation, right? So in that range, which could be like a pound per body weight is the easier way that I remember it. What's your thought in your female athletes? Like, do you feel like they struggle a little bit more and you have to find some strategies to sneak that in?
Yeah. So for what it's worth, it's a totally fair point. It was a big generalization to say like everybody gets enough protein or, but I do think generally speaking, because of the portion sizes in America
Right.
and things like that, people often do get a lot of protein, but it's usually dosed like in some
Right.
enormous amount at once.
Right.
But I hear what you're saying too. To the female point, yes, it depends. So with female athletes and getting enough protein in my setting, I definitely do see some struggle with it, especially for instance, like freshman year, they get here and now all of a sudden they're eating at the dining halls and they don't like how it's prepared and it's not like mom makes it and you name it. So I do think it can be a challenge, like a little bit more so in that group. But I find it's more because of the setting, at least for the athletes I work with. But I guess I would add to that too. More commonly, we see female athletes wanting to be vegetarian and or vegan. And so that can be a challenge as well. So like so many things, there's so many situations that can warrant this, but I guess where I would maybe leave my thought is that I do think the dosing of protein is like one of the most important aspects. And really, especially if you're including meat and things like that, meat, dairy products, it can add up to meet that RDA pretty reasonably if you're including it frequently.
Let's put some numbers on it. Let's say you have a 200-pound athlete, whatever position, whatever sport, and you want them to, like, what would be your target for that person and how would you dose it throughout the day?
So they're going to make me do like quick math in my head. That's a challenge. I agree with the general range you gave. Right. So I usually, for an athlete participating in like a power or strength-based sport would say on the higher end of that range, probably like 1.8 to 2. And so 200, 180, like 180 grams to 200 grams in there. And in terms of dosing it, I usually, again, these are total guesstimations, but I live in guesstimation world because I work with 18 to 22-year-olds. I usually advise them to try to get at least 40 grams a meal. That often ends up equaling kind of what we're talking, probably close to 200 grams by the time they eat over,
Sure.
few meals, few snacks. So that would be, I guess, one part of it. And then post-workout, we are trying to make sure that we're really cognizant that they're getting protein post-workout. And so I'm advising them to get at least 20, if not upwards of 40 grams in that post-workout time frame. And that depends a little bit on their schedule. If they're going to have like a quick shake and they're heading to dinner next, I'm not so worried about them getting it right then. But if they're maybe finishing their workout in the morning and they're going to class and they're going to go sit in class for 2 hours, then I'm like, all right, let's grab a couple of these shakes or a shake and this to make sure that we get maybe upwards of that 40 grams.
Yeah. Gotcha. The other thing we were earlier talking about, kind of how you have to drill into the details further and further as somebody gets to be a higher level, but also perhaps as we get closer to our goals, right? So, for instance, let's take wrestler, right? Because I think that's a weight-based sport, and we have to be very, very specific. We of course want to preserve as much lean mass as possible, and they're trying to cut weight like crazy. I mean, those people are impressive, right? And so you want to be extremely strategic and smart about how you do it, and you also want to be aggressive at the same time. So those are the people that I worry about sometimes in terms of the hydration piece, the micronutrient, that kind of stuff. If you're longitudinally following some of your wrestlers at the elite level, how do you track their macro and micronutrients and stuff like that? Just kind of, I'm thinking about logistically with you and your team. Do you guys have an app or something that you use? Is it frequent check-ins, phone calls? Like what kind of system does an institution like yours use? Or really any high-level institution?
Sure. Yeah. So we do, we use a couple different apps. Probably the big one for something like this is a program called Notemeal that allows kind of on both ends, it allows the dietitian to create a meal plan for an athlete. And then on the athlete's side, allows them to see that meal plan, track what they're intaking, and it shows like whether they're meeting those targets. We also are lucky at our level to be able to provide our athletes with a lot of meals. So it's not that they're not having any meals on their own, but we do provide a lot of meals. And so I can tell you, I haven't worked with wrestling in a while, but I have at some point while I've been here. The dietitian on my staff who works with wrestling right now is very involved. And so it is a very specific conversation with our chef on staff to say, okay, this guy needs this guy needs this. And it does get pretty nitty gritty, not even just down to, of course, calories. It also is looking at macronutrients. It's looking at sodium. She's accounting for how much weight they swing overnight, looking at hydration, their hydration testing. I mean, it's incredibly involved. And I feel like it has to be to do it well, because to your point, it's craziness what those guys and girls do. So I think it's really important, and I know it's not realistic across the board, but I think it's really important for athletes in weight-based sports like that to have a very purposeful approach with it, because it can be dangerous, right? If you're not cutting weight appropriately, if you're taxing your system, all your organ systems with inappropriate cutting of the weight and things like that. So it's a very involved process for sure with an athlete like that. And I guess the last thing I'll say too is that the other hard part is it's this delicate balance of being incredibly specific and helping those athletes meet their weight goal in an appropriate way, but also like letting them live their life and trying not to foster disordered eating habits and things like that. Because the other piece of this is that it takes some really meticulous counting of, macros and things, but we don't want them doing that all the time. And so again, having a dietitian involved is very helpful in that, but I recognize not everybody has the ability to do that.
it's truly an art that I've learned to appreciate over time. I remember, I mean, to your point, when people are leaving, a lot of times this is the first time 18-year-olds get to leave their home and don't have oversight of their parents, right? And they've got the quote unquote freedom. And, thinking about everything else, all the extracurriculars, the lack of oversight, everything that comes with that, and really getting dialed into this full-time job that you talked about. I mean, heck, I just think about my first time going to campus and just being there, and I just had unlimited meal, and the meals were so good. And I was eating 3 plates, and within 3 months, I had not even 3 months, 2 months, I had put on my freshman 15, and it's the heaviest I had ever been. And again, I wasn't, nobody like was holding me accountable. It didn't really matter other than the stretch marks that I had forever. But I digress. But for these athletes, you highlighted about the challenges, and one of the pieces that you mentioned is just really a time investment that people fail to appreciate. I remember working with the Rutgers football team for some time, and it was a machine, right? How these guys they have 2 practices to starting 5 o'clock in the morning. Then they would have the breakfast and stuff laid out, then go to class, and then they would have practice afterward. And by the time their structured day was done, I don't know, it was like 8:30. I had one of my friends who initially, I knew this because he wanted to go to medical school and he would start it. And I was just thinking, I was like, I was already struggling not having all those requirements to get good grades, to get a high enough GPA to be a good med school. And so the appreciation that I have for anybody who plays at a Division I level, and especially at one of those good Division I schools, such as your school, and then gets into medical school, that's next level stuff, right? And that's not easy to do. So I'd love to kind of hear some other challenges to quote unquote healthy nutrition that in your experience athletes face that I think the general folks don't have a good appreciation for. Maybe you could dive a little bit into that. And then how do you help them navigate that, particularly early on? First time 18-year-old, 19-year-old, okay, listen, this is really important, and here's how we're practically going to do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, schedule for sure is one of the big ones. It can be a doozy because I think between you and I have mentioned a lot of the instances, right? But they have practice, they have lifts, they have conditioning sessions. They might even have extra conditioning or weightlifting depending on their goals. They have film, often, some kind of meetings with their coaching staff, regardless of sport. A lot of our sports have that, not just football. And then you cut to their academics. So they have their academic requirements. So they're going to class. They have probably tutors and things because they don't have the ability to maybe make the recitation or, whatever that they might have had if they weren't busy with all their athletic stuff. So they have their academic stuff. And then, you and I have been in college. They also want to try to have some semblance of a social life. And so there are just so many requirements that take up their time. And we didn't even talk about prehab, rehab. I mean, hopefully you're not injured, but if you are, I always feel for our athletes who are in the training room a lot because it's like, oh my gosh, you just lost another hour or 2 of your day because you're in here rehabbing your injury. So a lot of time goes into those things. I think the other thing that's an enormous chunk of time that people don't recognize is the travel. And so when you're in season, and of course this depends a little bit on your sport, when you're in season, you're traveling a lot. And some of our sports, for instance, are outdoor sports that play in the spring. So softball, baseball, I mean, they'll spend their first 4 to 8, sometimes weeks traveling to the coasts because they're warm enough to play. And so imagine starting your spring semester and you're trying to learn your classes and get a hold of, whatever's going on in them. And you're also spending at least 3 days a week, if not a week at a time, sometimes in another state playing. Of course, our athletes have a lot of resources, right? They have tutors and they have the ability to have exams proctored on the road. And so there's a lot of kind of perks in that way. But the reality is too, that they're gone a lot and they're traveling a lot and they're trying to do this stuff in a hotel room after they just played a game, maybe after they just lost a game and they're not in a good mood. And the last thing they want to do is frickin' study for that exam. So the travel's pretty crazy. I think people don't really grasp that. And postseason, especially if you're a basketball team playing in March Madness, you hope that you have lots of weekends of that. And you could be getting home late Sunday night, early Monday morning, depending on what time your game was played. And then you turn around and leave the following Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on when you're playing. I mean, it's just constant sometimes. So our athletes spend a lot of time on planes, buses, all the above. And it can definitely, it's just an exhausting lifestyle sometimes. And the TV has made it worse. The TV is great because it generates money and we all like the money, but the TV times, you have to have enough time slots to get all these games in. And so we're seeing a lot more 7:30 p.m., 9 p.m. I feel for the West Coast teams that end up playing at very odd times because, or actually sometimes it's for us, like our teams will sometimes play in tournaments on the West Coast and it's like 11 midnight our time.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of crazy.
Yeah. I hate traveling. My wife's originally from the West Coast, from California. And so, I love California, but I hate the time difference stuff because I get there and, you're seeing family and stuff. And it's like 11:30 my time. And I'm like, guys, hey, heck, I didn't even stay up to watch the finals last night because I was like, listen, I'm too tired. Right. We're talking about father again. So I can't imagine having to perform at such a high level, physically, emotionally, cognitively. And the other interesting piece that strikes, is interesting to me is I think, with the traveling of the professional athletes, yes, professional athletes have the same, well, probably greater physical demands because they're playing more games throughout the year, as well as, the cognitive demand and the time stuff. But when they're studying, they're doing the film sessions, that cognitive burden, the attention piece that you talked about after having lost, you're still invested in your craft, right? So you're watching your mistakes and stuff. And so it maybe doesn't hurt as much. But the last thing you do after you maybe haven't had a good performance and go is maybe write a paper on some arbitrary topic in your English class or some engineering class or whatever topic it is. Like, you're like, I'm not going to do this. Like, it's so hard. And then you're expected to get good grades, right? I mean, I don't even know what that's like, but it definitely gives me, it makes me pause and a lot of respect for those high level athletes. But I do want to talk a little bit about the cognitive piece, right? We know maybe it's just as critical. We talk about decision making. How important is that to your sport, right? I think a lot of times people, when they think about athletes, they're just focused on the physical aspect, but the cognitives might be just as important. How do you have the conversation about nutrition and just optimal cognitive performance? Are there certain metrics that you look at? Any specific things you think about fueling for that aspect of performance?
Yeah, probably the biggest one, again, is just carbohydrate and making sure that athletes are consistently including it. And it's not that you need like gobs of carbohydrate to fuel cognitive performance, but when you have an athlete who is under fueling in general, and especially with carbohydrate, so they're not eating carbs consistently, that really can cause some of that, quote, brain fog, just inability to focus and to retain. And so we do talk about that a lot. Just, your brain prefers to use glucose and you got to have some carbohydrate on deck to have that available. So that's probably the biggest talking point that we talk to our athletes about from a cognitive standpoint. Other than that, it would be just, brain health and making sure we're talking about omega-3 fatty acids and some of that stuff. Creatine is starting to be more and more exciting on that front. And so we might have those kind of conversations, but probably from a like baseline level, it's just that like consistently fueling, making sure that you have food on deck and that it includes some carbohydrate to help fuel the mental aspect, not just in the classroom, but for your sport too, right? Like I'm always shocked that our football players can learn the playbook. When I see it, I'm just like, having been a soccer player where you like hardly have plays per se, I'm like, I don't know how you retain that. So that's probably the biggest talking point that we would bring up.
So I didn't want to go down this hole, but I'm sure some people at this point are probably thinking, well, what about ketones, right? We know that glucose is the preferred fuel source, but there's lots of discussion out there about how, ketogenic diet and ketones, and people can perform really well. After you get through that phase of withdrawing from carbohydrates, you have this clarity and all these buzzwords that people will use, right? So I don't know if you got a chance to see the Limitless series with Chris Hemsworth, right? Where he was like fasting for 3 days and all of a sudden he was in the water and was trying to catch fish and he had this like, I forget what he said, but he had a lot of clarity, right? So your ketones are ramped up and whatnot. And then there will be people like I'm talking about endurance-based athletes, right? These ultra marathoners. Can't think of this guy who was on. I can't think of it, but these some of those marathoners, ultra marathoners, who will say you can become fat adapted. That term, right? And so be on a ketogenic diet and still performs well. If you have athletes or individuals who come it from that angle, what's the conversation like for you?
Yep. So this is a soapbox. So you started it. Um, so what I would say is that it is true and it is fair to say that you, especially you mentioned like endurance, ultra endurance, those folks can function fairly well with a ketogenic diet if they are actually following a ketogenic diet and they keto adapt and all the things. The research, though, I like to point out, the research really shows that they can perform as well. There is really not great research at this point to show that they can perform better. And that's from an endurance and ultra endurance standpoint. So mostly aerobic capacity exercise. So that is fair to say. With that said, I should have put this one in my pet peeve pile, but one of my biggest pet peeves is people saying that they are in ketosis, but they have a cheat day, or I'm in ketosis, but I see them, eating easily 60 grams of carbohydrate in there, something or other. And so what I like to make sure people understand is just understanding what ketosis really is, or what a ketogenic diet really is, which is not only is it very low carb, very, very low carb, 30 to 50 grams generally max a day, which is like a Cliff Bar. It's also very high fat and it's low protein. And that's another pet peeve, people on the ketogenic diet that are just like smashing protein. Mm-hmm. And I like to alert them of this process in our body called gluconeogenesis. And I'm like, your body's turning that protein into carbohydrates. But that's neither here nor there. So I like to make sure that people understand that process, because a lot of people are not actually in ketosis, in my opinion, that are, they have their giant bowl of berries and they are eating a ton of protein and what have you. With that said,
or maybe the carnivore crowd eating tons and tons of steak.
Yes. So when I have an athlete come to me about keto diets, which is not unusual, it definitely happens with some regularity. My biggest thing is that I need them to understand, like, it's probably not realistic for your lifestyle, and that it just kind of like is what it is. For most of our sports, I mean, we have, of course, cross country and we have endurance swimmers, but most of our sports are not, I apologize, my dinging in the back. Most of our sports have very much an anaerobic component, right? Soccer, volleyball, football, track events. I mean, most of our sports, wrestling, there's so much of an anaerobic component, and the research is not good to support that a ketogenic diet can improve performance for anaerobic sports. So essentially, I'm like, if you're playing a sport or a position where it involves pushing, jumping, diving, hitting, like explosive things, ketogenesis is not your friend. Like, we need carbohydrate to fuel that activity. So that's a big education component, I think, for them. And then just even talking through, again, I work with 18 to 22-year-olds that live on a college campus. When I really explain to them, like, okay, if you wanted to do this, how would we get to ketosis? And then explain, like, no, you can't have that beer on the weekends. What are you going to do when your team's traveling? Right? Like, are we going to be able to pull this off? I never want to come at it from like a judgy standpoint, because like I said, there are some people like it, some people feel better on it, or they claim to at least. And I can't take away anybody's lived experience, right? And that's one of the harder parts about nutrition, is that so much is anecdotal and people try to shove their anecdote down a million people's throats. But the hardest part, though, for my setting, and I would say it applies to a lot of people, is it's just not very realistic to really carry out ketosis. And especially when you consider that it takes a good, usually like 4 to 6 weeks to keto adapt. You can do it quicker, but generally, and you kind of feel like shit in the meantime. What are we doing? If we're like ebbing in and out of this state, you're probably not performing your best during that time. And we only have so much time to work with in your training period or off season or what have you. So that was a really long answer, but I told you started it. Those are my thoughts on ketosis.
No, I love it. I thought it was important to take that detour because I know people are thinking it, and I get that question often enough, and you're clearly better equipped to answer it than I am. So we will be sure to point them more towards your social media and follow you if they have further questions, and you can educate them there. I'd love to see selfishly. I want to know about, right. So now I'm not definitely a professional athlete, not even a high level athlete. Not sure I ever was, but a lot of people who are listening might not be high level athlete, but I do think they're high performers in some capacity. Right? A lot of medical trainees and people who just have to be their optimal self. Maybe it's being a parent. Maybe it's being a business executive, whatever it might be. What are some strategic or tactical things that we can extract that maybe that you could tell us that we might be able to extract with your experience from working with high level athletes that we might be able to employ into our daily lives?
Yeah, so I think my first thought would be to encourage people to think about like the foundational nutrition things that we can do. And I talk to high level athletes about this too. People want to get the next best supplement. They want to get that fancy new, whatever approach. But my best analogy is, if you're not eating regularly, if you're not hydrating, if you're not doing foundational things, but you're trying to get this supplement, it's like putting really nice rims on your piece of shit car.
Hmm.
Like, what are we doing? Right? You got to have the foundational stuff there, the habits to then maybe a supplement does make sense, but not if we're not eating food. Right. So with that said, I would say like everybody practically can benefit from some of those foundational things. To me, those things are eating frequently, like not skipping meals. That can be really helpful from a metabolic standpoint. It helps promote building muscle. It helps promote having energy. So like aiming to eat every 3 to 4 hours, something, it could be a meal, it could be a snack. I think that's a really good habit. I think I mentioned that plate earlier. I think that is a very good foundational habit that a lot of people could do better with, is just thinking about like, do I have a carb and a protein? Am I including some kind of fruit or veggie? Even if it's, a canned fruit or a canned veggie or frozen or applesauce. I mean, there's lots of ways we can do that. I think some people get intimidated by like, oh, what am I going to do? Have steamed broccoli at lunch? Or, no, I mean, grab an apple, grab a banana, have a mandarin orange cup, whatever. So I think that's a really good foundational habit, is just checking those boxes. Do I have a carb? Do I have a protein? Do I have a fruit or veggie? Hydration. Am I drinking water consistently throughout the day, or am I showing up to practice or to, whatever obligation I have and then chugging a bunch of water because I realized I haven't all day? Those are probably a few big ones coming immediately to mind. I'm sure there are others. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Those are my big ones from like, again, a foundational standpoint.
Love that. No, base of the pyramid, right? Take care of the basics first. Basics over time is and consistently, right? That keep coming up. Which reminds me, an amazing resource that somebody I listen to a lot is E.C. Sinkowski Consistency Project. There's a reason why that's named that way. Um, all right, I promised you that I would ask you about influencers again, and maybe not in the sense that you might be expecting, but I've been thinking about this a lot, right? So with NIL, right, name, image, likeness for people who don't know, I think a lot of people understand that college athletes are now getting paid for basically their brand. Okay, and I think about growing up. You had all these professional athletes, and you had cereal companies taking the professional athlete, putting them on the box, and just if you're a kid growing up and you see your favorite athlete, LeBron James, or somebody on the box of cereal, you think that's the breakfast of a champion, right? And don't get me wrong, I love cereal. Okay, it's just not the breakfast of a champion. And I think about college athletes now with NIL and their branding and stuff, and different food organizations and companies and coming to them to use that for branding and compensating them appropriately. Do your athletes ever come to you to talk about that? Because sometimes it is an internal struggle. Like, hey, maybe if we're trying to, as you mentioned, fight the good fight and to combat bad information with good information, maybe promoting this message that X, Y, and Z is a healthy nutrition food and stuff like that is not the best thing. How do you think about that? How do you counsel your 18 or 20-year-old young minds? How do you influence them in that regard?
Yeah, so we do have that conversation with some frequency. Our athletes are being approached by all kinds of companies and products wanting them to endorse their product in some way. And I love when athletes do at least ask the question, like, is this okay? Like, can I be taking this? And so our role really is just to educate them on, like, I'm not here to say, like, yes, do that deal, or no, don't do that deal. But I can educate around whether I would recommend that product, right? And even, I don't have a good example, but I can think of a couple times where an athlete was like, well, like, what if I don't even use it though? What if I just like do the deal and like endorse it, but I'm not actually using it?
Mm.
And I think that's a good lesson for everyone listening. And I don't, again, I don't think we have a lot of people doing that, but I guarantee there's a lot of people out there doing that, not just athletes. We're talking influencers, right? I think it's a good reminder that people can say they're using all kinds of stuff. And I think that frequently when I see influencers touting whatever product, I'm like, you're probably not even using that, but okay. So I think that's a good reminder for people. But my message to them is always, I mean, yeah, you could do that, but think about, like, you're putting your name on that brand. And if you don't even feel confident enough to use it, who's to say that they, maybe they'll have an issue, that company, maybe another athlete's using it who does pop for a drug test. And then is that gonna put a bad connotation on you? And so again, I'm not here to tell them like, yeah, do or don't do that. But I do think it's been, in those couple times it's come up, like a good thought process of like, oh yeah, like I would be putting my name with this, So it's definitely an interesting conversation. And I mean, I think NIL for the large part has been great. Like with anything else, there's always going to be probably some bad ways you can take it. But overall, it's been a really good opportunity for our athletes to, get compensated for their brand, which they hadn't been able to do. But there is kind of that risk, if you will, that these companies want to take advantage of them. And especially when you've got young athletes who are just kind of excited to have any opportunity like that, it can be really easy for them to say like, oh, sure. And a lot of it too, like the brands just want to send them free product. It's not like a cash deal or anything, just like, here's a box of free product. And so my advice is always like, is that worth a risk, just for a box of their shakes or a box of their energy drinks or whatever? In my opinion, no, but you have to make that call.
Totally. Yeah. And the other piece of it is, we're talking about people saying they're using products and not using. The flip side too, right? We have these before and after transformational pictures with a lot of coaching folks, and they'll say, oh, look, after whatever, 2 months or 6 weeks, you look X, Y, and Z. And it's like, because I use this method to get there. No, actually, you might have used some products, right, legal or illegal, to be able to get there. And so that's the other piece of it. It's like, are you getting to your results, the outcomes that you're promoting by the methods that you say you're getting them, without any assistance, we'll say.
Yeah.
I also want to get your thoughts on, we talked about pet peeves, and I wanted to kind of ask you about misconceptions and common myths, but it's similar enough to pet peeve, unless you think that that's a different question. And there are some common misconceptions or current nutrition myths that you want to debunk. Again, we could probably be here for hours, which neither one of us have. So are there some certain myths for high-level performance athletes? I think one thing you've touched time against, carbs are bad for you, and they're not. They're actually critical for high performance. What are some other, like one or two that people immediately come to you that you have to be like, that's a myth, doesn't apply?
Maybe, I mean, supplements come to mind. I think sometimes, elite level athletes think like, I need a supplement because I'm an athlete. And it's true to say that athletes do have some micronutrient needs that are higher than the lay person because they're using a lot more energy.
I want to ask, I was going to say, are there any supplements? I can think of 2 supplements off the top of my mind when I have my athletes talk to me, or anybody, or really any general population, for health and longevity, that they are inexpensive enough. And I think the reward to risk ratio is just proportionate enough where I'm like, I think it's a great idea. I can think of 2 off the top of my head. And I know you've talked about this in the presentation where we connected, but are there any supplements like that for you?
Yes. So I guess I'll tie the bow on the last thought, which was purely that there are some things that athletes need more of, right? There are different micronutrients. But the other thing you have to remember is that they're generally they should be eating more food too. And so a lot of times the higher micronutrient needs are met by eating more calories. With that said, yes, there are some things, again, I keep coming back to the population I work with, because people can take a lot of things and go a lot of different ways with it. But in the population I work with, my college athletes, like, do I think a multivitamin is a helpful thing for a lot of people? Yes, I do. Because the reality is they're not generally eating a totally balanced diet that's hitting all the micronutrients that they might need. So I frequently recommend a multivitamin. Vitamin D is one that I frequently recommend. We also have the luxury of testing vitamin D levels, so that makes it easier to do that. But even like a low dose vitamin D, I think can be really helpful. For female athletes, I think iron can be very helpful, but I would not dose iron unless I had gotten it tested. But I do think it's a good idea for female athletes, especially endurance female athletes, to get their iron tested, because that can really impact performance if it's low. And then past that, a couple others, again, not maybe across the board, but generally speaking, omega-3 fatty acids, I think, are great to supplement. The reality is that a lot of athletes aren't getting a lot of foods that are high in those and aren't eating a lot of seafood and things like that. And we're starting to understand a lot more about neuroprotective qualities of omega-3s. And so, especially in a sport that's concussion prone, I think that's important for them to at least be considering that. And maybe the other one is creatine can be really helpful. And I think historically people, and myself included, honestly, like when I was, in college, I would have said, creatine's good for building mass, but it can be dangerous depending on certain situations, and not really good for endurance. And now the more we understand about creatine, the more we're understanding that like it really applies in so many ways to brain health. Female athletes can really benefit from it. Endurance athletes can benefit from it. So I'm not here to say like I would be like, everyone listening, go take creatine. But for a lot of athletes in a lot of situations, a good creatine monohydrate can be really beneficial.
Totally. It's funny that this last one, that's the first one I'll think of. And I'll tell you why. I recently had one of the residents ask me, because we were talking about this stuff. It's like, what are the top 5 supplements you would recommend? I was like, okay, well, first of all, I need to ask you 10 questions before I can answer the question, right? And as you highlighted, it's so incredibly contextual, like person to person to person. That aside, growing up, we learned about creatine, you associated with hypertrophy and strength, right? And then power, development, all that kind of stuff. But the data on cognitive health, as you talk about traumatic brain injury and just memory, the data on mood-related stuff and depression stuff, it's just so incredibly promising. And the other thing, it's dirt cheap, right? And so I tell the people that I work with is probably aside from caffeine, there's no other supplement out there that has better data than creatine. And considering how cheap it is, pure good old creatine monohydrate, I think any exercising individual, it couldn't hurt to be able to take that. But again, no medical advice here. None of us are recommending. It's very contextual. That's the other thing to keep in mind.
Can I add one other thing too,
yes,
with just the supplement, just because I would lose sleep at night if I didn't say it out loud. I'm a big proponent of making sure people understand that supplement box labels are not well regulated in our country. So if you're seeking out a supplement, it's so important that it has third-party testing, because that essentially allows us to know that the label is accurate. And I think people don't have nearly enough of a grasp on how inaccurate the labels can be. So the third-party testing that I recommend are USP is a great one for vitamins, especially NSF for sport is kind of our gold standard. And then informed choice and informed sport are probably like those 4 are the ones I consistently look for. So no supplement, like there's no way to 100% guarantee safety, but we feel really good if a supplement carries one of those third-party testing labels. Because without it, I mean, I don't know, right? I don't know if the label is accurate. I don't know if the ingredients are accurate. It might be contaminated, and people kind of scoff when I say that, but it's actually like wildly common when you look at the studies that just randomly test off the shelves.
Do you look for the good manufacturer practices approval, like the CGMP part of it, or is this sufficient, the 4 that you mentioned right here?
I don't personally, in my opinion, if a product has third-party testing that I just mentioned, it would be a no-brainer that it also has good manufacturing practices.
Got it. Awesome. I would also want to ask you about emerging trends. We recently had a conversation. We're going to be releasing it very shortly about CGMs and that kind of stuff. Would love to get your thoughts on that. Not necessarily for the high-performing athlete, collegiate athlete. I think I probably know where you stand, but if you'd like to share it, I'd love it. But bringing it back to the general population, talking about metabolic ill health is at an all-time high, 50% obesity rates probably in about 7 years in the United States at least, right? Cardiovascular disease, all that kind of stuff. And the role of CGMs and maybe other emerging trends / cutting edge nutritional tactics, strategies, technology that you're excited about. What can you think about?
What do you want me to hit first, CGM or?
Take it, whatever you please. Yeah.
I think the thing I'd say just briefly about CGM is I think it can be helpful for folks. I don't love that it has created some problems for those who like live and die by it, our diabetic folks.
Like a shortage?
Yes, at least at some point. And it might have been corrected in the meantime, but I know that was problematic for a while. I think it could be helpful to kind of gain some insight for people. But I think of it similar to like, an exercise tracker or various things that we have where it can get really obsessive really quickly. And so do I think somebody should like live with a CGM that doesn't need a CGM per their diabetic diagnosis for long lengths of time? No, personally, I don't. I think it becomes a bit obsessive and a bit much and could kind of fall down some disordered eating rabbit holes. But I do think it can be helpful to show insight and help people understand. A kind of similar vein, I think it's a little bit to me too, like almost like we were talking about, like athletes want to jump straight to the supplements. Like I'd want to know, like, have you made some good lifestyle changes? Are you active? Are you kind of paying attention to what you eat? Are we balancing our plate a little bit better? Things like that before I'm just like slapping a CGM on and trying to really fine tune before I maybe have foundational stuff down. And the last thing I'll say about it is that I do think it's important for people to understand too, that like, it's normal to have fluctuations in blood glucose, I have started to see some trends. I don't know if that's the right word, but people essentially insinuating that like, you should have this like perfect maintenance of your blood glucose. And, it needs to be in this really narrow window all the time. But it's important to like understand that our body has these hormones that affect our blood glucose for a reason. And yes, you don't want to spend a ton of time hyperglycemic, obviously, or hypoglycemic, but it also is normal to have some fluctuations. And I've seen some people get really stressed about that, and that can be just as unhealthy. So maybe that's where I'll leave that topic, is just to say, and in general, I think people oftentimes forget that like the stress of some of these things that is caused for some people is for sure, in my opinion, worse than some of what they're trying to monitor. Stress can be really detrimental.
That'll mess up your glucose.
No doubt. Other trends. I think I'm excited to see where some of the like personalization can go. We're like just scratching the surface what we know about the microbiome. I think that by the time I retire, I imagine that'll be like a whole different world. Similarly we're just starting to understand genetic variations. And there's, some really helpful genetic stuff we already know. But again, I shudder to think what we'll know in 50 years or something. So I think that'll be interesting. I do think it's probably a double-edged sword, just kind of like the CGM, like I was saying. It's probably good in some ways, and it's probably too much in some ways for people to be honing in on every little detail of their nutrition, because at some point you just have to live your life too and enjoy the things that we're eating and doing and whatnot. So those are probably a couple, I think, exciting, hopefully not too scary developments that I think we'll continue to hear more and more about.
Yeah, no, I love that. We've been talking a lot about health tech lately, and to your point about the stress thing, I think, and I've talked about this before. I had the Oura Ring for a while, and at some point, the behavior of getting up in the morning and running to go check my score I realized was more detrimental, right? And once I learned the actionable thing about how to adjust my temperature with my chili pad, with my Uller, like I got that information, then I knew that it was time to kind of just put it in the bank, and I haven't charged it in months, and I don't know if I ever need to go back to it. So I certainly agree there. As we come to a close, there are two more things that I do want to talk to you about, because I think that when you gave that lecture, you talked a little bit about people staying in their lane. And this comes up from time and time again, right? Everybody feels like they are a nutrition expert because it's involved in most of our lives. Everybody eats multiple times a day. You think you have a say, you've had an experience, and all of a sudden your anecdote becomes anecdata, right? And, and then the other piece of it, like you talk about nutritionist versus dietitian and stuff. And so everybody's giving nutrition advice everywhere you go, and including healthcare practitioners, right? Physicians, physical therapists and stuff like that. And not everybody's equipped to, and everybody should. And if that was the case, I think we probably wouldn't be as in much of a mess. Like nutrition would not be the most polarizing health topic out there. What do you tell people about staying in your lane, particularly my healthcare colleagues? Like, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I guess maybe I would lead with saying I get it in terms of why it happens so frequently. It's partly what you just alluded to, right? Like everybody eats, and maybe you made a change that really helped you, and so you want to tell the next person. So that's part of it. The anecdotal thing is kind of nightmarish in the way that it can so quickly spread. And the reason it doesn't work for everybody is that everybody's living a different life, right? Your lifestyle and your stressors and your schedule. I mean, it's all different. But so is everything I also just mentioned, right? Genetics and my microbiome and all these things that, like, quite literally what you succeeded with could be a disaster for me. So we don't love the anecdote, but I get why people are sometimes eager to share, healthcare practitioners or not. The other hard part, at least in our setting, especially in athletics, is that, like, you might not have a dietitian right down the hallway, or in a lot of cases, people were doing our jobs before we existed. In athletics, the dietitian has only really been like a kind of core person on staff for the last 5 to 10 years. And so somebody had to be answering the questions before. It might have been the athletic trainer, it might have been the strength coach. And so I only say that to say I get it in terms of why it happens so much. But with that said, I think one of the best analogies that's in my brain and that I've shared with some of my physician friends and other healthcare practitioners is, as a dietitian, I took lots of science, right? I took lots of anatomy. I took exercise phys. I took all the biologies and you name it. We took all the science. I have a pretty good understanding of the cardiac anatomy and how, stroke volume and heart rate vary. But I mean, all the things. But if I made a cardiac recommendation, that would be absurd, right? And people would be like, what? Like, you're a dietitian. Like, why would you possibly make that? And even if I turned around and said, oh, well, but I studied it and I got a certificate in it. Mm-hmm. And I actually even minored in cardiology. It's not a thing, but you get the idea. They would still think that's ridiculous, right? But a physician can literally say, whatever nutrition thing off the cuff, and people will go change their entire lifestyle around that one little thing, and it might not be backed in science at all, for one. And I guess maybe the other piece of that too is that you wouldn't expect a physician to stay up to date on nutrition stuff, right? Because you're staying up to date on your own stuff. And so a lot of the nutrition knowledge that's being shared in a healthcare setting is often very outdated, definitely not personalized, not taking into account things that we might take into account because we're trained to do that specific skill set. So it just ends up being kind of this big hot mess in a lot of ways. So I think, again, that analogy, I think can be helpful for people of yeah, I get that you know some things about nutrition, right? And I get that you understand metabolism and all those things. But the reality is that just like you spent X number of years studying this really specific thing, so did we. And that's why we're the best person to be giving that advice, because we're taking all these different considerations in that you wouldn't necessarily think about because it's not your area of expertise. So I might have derailed again. Did I answer the question?
No, you did. What I would just add is, yeah, that part really grinds my gears because, to be honest with you, I don't. When it comes to nutrition type stuff, everything that we've talked about, people will pick up. It's far less important to understand metabolism, and it's far more important to understand behavior and
For
context.
sure.
Right, every single thing. It's so contextual, and I think the most successful people are the ones who can really just step back. And when somebody asks this question, hey, like you said, is when somebody asks you, hey, what do you think about this, Lauren? Like, well, okay, let's take a step back, and it's all about education. And unfortunately, the system that we work in is just not the time. And I hate bashing my former colleagues. I do sometimes, and because I just think that we're just not equipped in the system that we're working in. We certainly can continue going down this pathway, and we have been for the last couple of years on how we can make it better. But I want to be respectful of your time. I do know we're coming up on it, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about The Healthy Former Athlete. And for those who don't know, this is the awesome book that you wrote. I love the subtitle here. It says Nutrition and Fitness Advice for the Transition from Elite Athlete to Normal Human. Okay. And so we're talking about, your collegiate athlete, that 22-year-old who's kind of going on, maybe taking the next step, but the next step isn't professional sport, right? Now, all of a sudden they've got the drop off. I've had a couple of folks, I've had a couple of my students who were college athletes, and now they're in medical school, and they've quickly realized that it's a different life from everything that you've talked about. And they've had to make some serious changes. And so what did, like, first of all, what was the genesis of this? Is this from your own journey to be able to write this book? And what are some key takeaways that you will sit down with, like, on their exit interview for your athletes and talk about, okay, listen, you're about to embark on a different journey in life, and your previous habits with your experience and your relationship with nutrition is going to change quickly. It's a whole book, so people can pick up for all that, but just maybe some pearls if you could share with us.
Yeah, well, it definitely spawned in some ways from my own experience. I felt pretty equipped compared to most people because I'd been studying nutrition and exercise. So I felt more equipped in that way. But I just remember so many times thinking, like, gosh, this is just bizarre, because I've spent my entire life practically being an athlete, and then one day it's just gone, right? Mm-hmm. You wake up and you're like, damn, I don't have to go to practice today. Like, I don't have any of that stuff that I had. So I definitely thought it was strange. I thought about it a lot, just how I'd not really thought about what that was going to be like. And then when I started practicing in the sports nutrition setting, I was hearing it a lot. Athletes were coming to me saying, like, okay, so what do I do now? How should I transition? And I remember early on, the genesis was, I sat down and thought, like, okay, we got to do more for our athletes in this way. We help them so many ways to be ready to be a college athlete, but we're just like, good luck, see ya on the way out. So I felt really passionate that I wanted to do something in that way. And I remember sitting down and thinking, like, okay, I'm just going to look up some resources, because there's got to be a lot of good resources out there for this topic. And I found none. Quite literally, I think none. And so that was the moment where I was like, well, maybe I'll make one. So it was a passion project over a couple of years. And yeah, that's, I think, really how it came about, was just seeing this total gap in it. I will say, from then to now, you can find a lot more resources. Still not many at all on the nutrition aspect specifically, but starting to be more on the mental health and just other considerations that go into it. So I think that's really cool that more and more people are talking about it. A couple of the big things, I think I always tell athletes, one of the best things they can do is just start thinking about it. Because that's one of the hardest parts, is that you almost actively don't think about it because you don't want to. Or you have the unfortunate scenario where you aren't prepared for it. It's the season or career ending injury. It's the getting cut at the professional level or the collegiate level. So I think just thinking about it, that can be a really healthy step, because it feels a little less traumatic. From a nutrition standpoint, I often just encourage athletes to start thinking, there shouldn't be any huge shift, but the reality is that our expenditure is going to change. at least for the majority of people, right? I mean, some people stay really active, but like you and I talked about, you start to have a family, you are working a full-time job, and the time gets really slim, and you start to really appreciate that time block that you had in the middle of your day. So I just encourage them to like be really honest with themselves. Like, it's gonna be really hard to keep up that expenditure, and that's okay. And nobody, like, it's not realistic for most people to even try. But what are we going to do instead of coming from here to here? Like, how are we going to stay active? And I'll come back to that in a sec. But also, if our intake has been here, how are we going to try to bring it down without without making these huge sweeping changes? So that's a lot of what I talk to athletes about, is like small, sustainable is the key word, changes that they can make that can help kind of bridge that gap in this new expenditure. Some meal prep, little tips and things like that as well. And then the activity piece is the other one. Like, how are you going to stay active? Because you got to stay active in some way, not just from an expenditure calorie standpoint, but also just from a health standpoint. How are you going to maintain some muscle? Your body's going to change, like it or not. You're not going to have that same physique forever, but how can you maintain a muscle, and how can you kind of age gracefully, if you will? If we don't do all of these things at once, like, it can really smack people in the face. And the last thing I'll say, because this was the biggest piece for me, is just, and my book only briefly hits on it because I am not a psychologist, but just starting to think about like the mental health piece and the identity. I really struggle with that. Like, if I'm not a soccer player, what am I? And the friends piece, that was like by far the biggest part for me, is just like you're almost your whole life constantly surrounded by this peer group that has this really key thing in common with you. And my college teammates are my best friends, still are. Like, you're just like always together. And then all of a sudden you like all move across the country, and you're
Right.
like, whoa, like, how do I even make friends in the real world? It feels like dating a little bit. So that's kind of my, like, in a nutshell, things that I talk about in the book, and that I try to highlight to athletes that I talk to in real life as well.
Yeah, that last piece is probably the most interesting to me. The conversation that I find myself having time and time again with the collegiate athletes that I've seen, or even the high school athletes who are not going to play at the next level, right? And they've established this bond with people, and they've been playing since Pee Wee, and now they're like, after high school, they're going to college across the country, and it's just something that I think about that I'm sure you and I can talk about for hours, but we might have to save that for part two. Resources aside from your book, other resources that you think would be good for people to tune in to get good nutrition advice, right? People to point to that you think are doing good work. What comes to mind?
Are we talking like social accounts?
Anything.
Well, I was just this is like a throwback book, but Nancy Clark, one of the like OGs in sports nutrition, her book is super digestible, like a really easy read. It's meant for like from the athlete's perspective. So I think that one is a nice, super easy read. There's also Fueling Young Athletes, I want to say. I don't want to butcher the title, but those are a couple great resources that people could check out. And then some people online that I think do a great job. Jessica Isaacs is one of my former interns. Jessica, the sports RD, she's doing a great job on social and in a really fun, relatable way. Who else from a sports nutrition standpoint? There's so many. I'm trying to think social. Soccer nutritionist. I'm gonna botch these names. I should have made a list.
I'm gonna find it and I'm gonna plug it in. You can send it to me later. How about that?
Okay.
Awesome. What about yours? Tell people your social media.
Yes, and definitely follow my social media. It's at Link to Nutrition. Lots of myth busting going on there.
Cool. We're gonna link all of that in the show notes. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for sitting down, for educating me, for educating the listeners. I love everything that you do, all the way that you think about it, and all the context you provide. Something that Darsh and I have really become fans of is the saying that context over content is so important. And I think that, it holds more true in the field of nutrition than it does in anything else. The last important question that we like to ask people, as you are a healthcare provider, is we're all about putting the health back in healthcare. So in maybe 100 words or less. How do you think we can do that?
Put the health back in healthcare. I don't know how to concisely say this, but I'll try. But I think in our setting in nutrition, we can make all the recommendations we want, but if people don't have access to food, how are they carrying it out? So, food insecurity, I think, is a really pressing issue for a lot of people, and really affects their ability to carry out a lot of what we would like them to do. So I don't know how we solve it. I wish I did in this moment, but I think if we can focus efforts towards that, making sure people have access to healthy food and water and clean water, that's a huge step and solves a lot of the problems right there.
Love it. We're going to get there. Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Medicine Redefined. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to check out some of the additional resources in the show notes. Please also check out our social media platforms where you can find more content like this. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at MedRedefined. We want to take a moment to thank our team for the production of this podcast, specifically Ethan Ju and Haritha Yepuri. Lastly, please remember the important disclaimer that everything in this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of medicine, nor should it be construed as medical advice. No physician-patient relationship is formed, and anything discussed in this podcast does not represent the views of our employers. We recommend that you seek the guidance of your personal physician regarding any specific health-related issues. However, if you enjoy the show, please be sure to subscribe, review, and share with anyone who you would think will gain value from this as well. Until next time, thank you for listening.